Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of The Verdict. I'm Spraying Pro 1000 and today I'm going to talk about Horizon Forbidden West. Now, it's actually kind of a little funny because I actually did not play the original Horizon game back when it came out. I actually played it right before Forbidden West came out. So, and what's going to kind of be the start of me reviewing sequels to games I did not play when they originally came out and were new, we're going to start with Horizon Forbidden West. So to give you some idea, the Horizon series is basically a post-apocalyptic series. It has a lot of emphasis on bow combat and using ranged weapons to take down monsters and sometimes human enemies as you free roam around the world map. It's got your typical selection of missions. It has a stealth aspect to it. It's got, RPG elements, not like super in-depth, but definitely a very decent amount of RPG elements to it. So whereas the first game I would say is very simple but effective in what it strives and sets out to do, Horizon Forbidden West immediately attempts to try to up the ante on almost every scale of the game. So for instance, whereas Horizon Forbidden West had a very simple monetary system and weapon upgrade tree where there's weapon rarities, and purple weapons are obviously the best, and then you have your usual blues, which are rares, and your greens, which are commons. In the sequel, no weapon is truly a real upgrade to another. Generally, higher tier weapons are better than lower tier weapons, but each weapon sort of has its own sets of pluses and minuses, and a lot of weapons received a lot of different nerfs. So for instance, the hunter bow in this game, in my opinion, is the best weapon, whereas in the original game I kind of felt like weapons were a little bit more evened out and were a little bit more unified in how usable they were. The hunter bow in Forbidden West is just a clear winner in terms of usability, ammo frequency, and ammo plentifulness, and just in general, all the different types of attacks you could deal with it. Whereas a lot of the other weapons receive nerfs. So for instance, the Tripcaster, which lays down trap wires that explode and can have elemental effects that can attach to enemies when they do, there's a trap limit now, and I feel like a lot of enemies are either too smart, too fast, or fly for the tripwire to really be effective. And there's a couple new weapons, there's a canister launcher, there's a shredder gauntlet, but ultimately what I found is pretty much similar to Dead Space or something. The best weapon is just the most basic. There's no real reason to mess around too much with these weapons outside of extremely niche scenarios where you're probably going to need just a little bit extra firepower, or if you really find a place where you could use it. Now, the core gameplay of Horizon Forbidden West is virtually unchanged compared to Zero Dawn. While the weapon selection might be a little bit worse off and worse for wear, for one reason or another, maybe one weapon is really heavy to use and therefore you can't dodge, or another weapon has a really long bow draw time, which is a real thing in this game. You're basically shooting arrows or shooting projectiles at monsters, at these big robot monsters, in order to strip them for their parts, which will allow you to hit their weak points and allow you to basically deal more damage to them until you can finally destroy them. In what is probably one of the few things I would argue in this game that is just a flat-out definite improvement, there's actually melee combat in Horizon, but usually the melee combat is not great. Zero Dawn, sorry, I keep forgetting the name of it. In Zero Dawn, the melee combat was actually rather lacking, I would argue. The melee combat was intentionally not great, so there was more of a focus on the bow and shooting things with the bow. You had a basic light attack and a basic heavy attack. It wasn't really something that you could easily chain together or anything. In Forbidden West, there's definitely a lot more emphasis on using light attacks and heavy attacks. And there's actual combos that you could do where you do light attack, pause, and then finish the combo. You could do hold heavy attacks, which do a lot of damage. They definitely fully fleshed out the melee tree, which leads me to my next point, that there are multiple trees that you can upgrade your character along. So in Horizon Zero Dawn, there were just 4 basic areas that you could upgrade in, machines, scavenging, combat, and I guess one more, I don't really remember. It was just a general sort of what upgrades can you grab in each tree, and each one definitely had a pretty good effect on combat. Some of them are really effective, some of them are just proprietary, right? Like if it's helpful, or not proprietary, I'm sorry, like situationally helpful, and some of them were just like, yeah, whatever. In Forbidden West, they completely revamped a lot of it. Some abilities you just start with, and they're just flat out abilities that you keep throughout the whole game. Like, you start the game with them, you keep them for the whole game. And then some abilities you have to re-earn, and most of the abilities are new. They, instead of having it just be like unlockable moves or abilities like walking on tripwires or something like that, a lot of there's 3 different kinds of nodes now. There's passive upgrades, which are basically what the previous game's abilities were for the most part. There's active upgrades, which are like, you can get different abilities that you could use in conjunction with your weapons. So for instance, on your hunter bow, you have to re-unlock the ability to notch multiple arrows. That's considered a weapon technique, which has its own stamina bar and everything that you can use. There's at least 2, if not 3 of these for every weapon in the game, including I think some for melee as well. And then lastly, there's new abilities called Overdrives. Basically, you could think of Overdrives like an ultimate. As you play, after unlocking an overdrive, you gain points, which gradually go from like doing anything really against an enemy, like attacking an enemy, stealth killing, hitting a weak spot, anything like that will gradually fill up your overdrive. And then when it's full, you could just use it and it'll have like a special effect. So for instance, the one that I used the whole game, and I never changed it from the start, was you can get a free heal. Basically, it's a massive heal over time, and also reduces the damage you take at higher levels. And that's another thing, each upgrade for these ultimates can be upgraded over and over and over again. So from like level 1 to level 3, and obviously the higher level you go, the more resistances that you get, the more stuff you get. And basically, I just used the one that gave me healing, and I never looked back. I just never needed anything else, and I never needed to look back. And for the most part, it worked out just fine for me. I never had a problem with it, never had to do anything too ridiculous. There's other ones. There's some that increase your damage, like your range damage, your melee damage. There's some that make you move faster. There's some that increase your stealth, right? But for the most part, I kind of feel like this falls into like the Division loophole, where it's like, if you can take better healing and the game is mostly combat, why wouldn't you take the better healing? You know what I mean? Like, wouldn't it just be smartest to just use the healing over and over and over again? And that's pretty much what I found. And in a lot of places, it basically made the game easier. And I guess like the ultimate like decisive factor of this whole what I'm talking about is that by the end of the game, like, I kind of feel like Forbidden West is another game where they have all these cool upgrades, they have all these cool like extra abilities, and they have all this cool stuff that they put in the game. And that's great, that's fine, that's amazing. But I will say that it kind of feels like a game where most of it doesn't matter. Even on, I mean, to be fair, I played on normal mode, but usually most normal modes, you kind of have to use some amount of stuff, right? Like, just by the end, I don't know, I'm not trying to say that the game should be like ridiculously hard, because there's definitely a lot of hard portions of the game and definitely a lot of challenging fights. But I would definitely say, like, I feel like a lot of systems just kind of end up not mattering. So if you just stack yourself for healing and just basically spam the hunter bow from start to finish, you pretty much will probably have no difficulty. I didn't really have much difficulty playing through this game, especially towards the latter half of the game. Like usual, when you get enough upgrades, you kind of just end up being brawlic, and like most things can't really bother you, and the most things can't really, damage you as efficiently. So that's one thing that I would say about Horizon Forbidden West, is while they have a lot of these things, like there's a whole new upgrade system that I actually think the upgrade system is kind of a detriment. So they increase the amount of machines that are available in this game, like to fight and to scavenge off of. And like any game with collectible monsters, or I'm sorry, not collectible monsters, defeatable monsters, you can collect a whole bunch of upgrade materials off of them that you could then use to increase your gear. It's like the most basic idea of scavenging loot to make yourself better. And in this game, they have that, but I think that they went a little bit too hard in the paint for it. I think that, what happens is that weapons have multiple tiers of upgrades, and so do armor in this game. And in order to make each tier, upgrade each tier from, level 1 to potentially like level 3, level 4, level 5, whatever the max level is, you have to go out and hunt, monster parts, right? And then you could use that, you could throw it in a pot basically, and then you could just throw it in a pot. You could just throw it on the weapon, and you have to find a workbench, and then you could just upgrade your stuff. But the problem with it is that they want you to find specific parts for each and every machine, and in my opinion, it's just a little too much. It's too involving. It's too much work. I much prefer if it were more streamlined. I feel like if they generalize the parts that you need to get, so instead of saying you need to hunt down flying machine A and land machine D, why not just have a general pool of land machine parts, right? Like instead of it being death machine glowing eye, why not just have it be like land monster I1, right? Just something simple, instead of it being a specific part from a specific enemy you have to defeat in a specific way, then when you get to like tier 4 or tier 5 of the upgrade tree, then make it so you have to hunt a specific part from a monster, because I personally feel that it's a lot of extra work, and ultimately it didn't really matter, because about halfway through the game I stopped caring about upgrading almost anything, and it almost didn't even matter. In fact, I'd argue it kind of didn't do anything at all, and I think that's partially what this game wants. It has a lot of farming, I guess, for so you have a high completion, or I'm sorry, that completion takes a while. But like, what's the point of doing all this farming and collecting if at the end of all of it, like, not really any of it is required or really worthwhile? I don't know. In my opinion, that's one of the foibles of this game, is that it really expects you to, I guess, do it. But I mean, by that same token, it doesn't. So it's just kind of a weird system where you could just like farm out a whole bunch of parts, and that's okay, I guess. But I mean, I don't know. It wasn't really like a super big deal. Beyond that, I would say that the number one thing that I also really didn't like about this game, well, I did like the graphics, right? So I will say that. But the number one thing that I really didn't like about this game is I feel like a lot of side quests just aren't very rewarding or meaningful. Not so much a super huge thing, but I really feel like if you're gonna have a game where you have like a whole bunch of rewards and a whole bunch of everything, like definitely have some rewards that feel like they're worth your time, because again, like towards the end of the game I wasn't really feeling any of the side quests anymore. I really feel like, other than ones that maybe impacted the story or added a little something extra, I really just did not really enjoy it too much. The one thing that I will say though is that the story of this game is pretty interesting, I'll say that. Whereas Horizon Zero Dawn is your typical like IP starter where they don't know if there's going to be demand for a sequel, so they just had a pretty clear-cut start to finish, open and shut, but there's room for more ending, which I think is perfectly fine. Forbidden West takes it on the next step and definitely sort of sets this up to have more story and make it wider and more interesting than the rest. And I really did enjoy it, actually. I think that Forbidden West has a really, really interesting story. So the story element of this game is definitely not one that I would say is to be missed. There are a couple parts of the game where I think like they didn't really like fully flesh out like plot lines and stuff. So like, for instance, there's one part halfway to like later on in the game where you're doing something for this guy and he betrays you, and it's like, it almost feels like the cutscene is unfinished, like there was supposed to be more there. It just comes off as feeling very awkward, right? Like, whereas there's so much detail on every other cutscene in the game, and there's so much like attention to everything, right? Like it just sort of feels like I don't want to say they skimped out. It just feels unfinished, I guess. And I'm trying to say this as spoiler free as possible. If you watch my playthrough, you probably would know exactly what I'm talking about. But it just feels weird. Like everything else has this big fanfare. All these characters get a lot of stuff. There's certain moments in the story that feel like they just did not. They drew the short end of the stick, right? They drew the small straw, and therefore, therefore they get to they have like nothing really going for them, and they just feel like kind of half done. But other than that, I like the story of this game. I think Aloy as a character got worse, in my opinion. I feel like they made her, like, I don't know, like, really annoying at some points. Sometimes she's fine. She's like her normal Zero Dawn self. But then other times she's just like this really obnoxious person. And I don't know, it kind of was fun for me to almost make fun of, like, how, like, tonal shift she is sometimes. But besides that, I like the new cast of characters they introduced. They introduced some of the old cast of characters. There's a good chunk of catching up. You know, there's a good chunk of catching up that you do at the beginning of the game to really establish what's happened in the couple of months since the end of Zero Dawn. And I really actually like that this game, you know, tries to really tie itself together and expand on the universe that they created with Zero Dawn. And I think that, honestly, I really enjoyed playing Zero Dawn right before this game, largely because I really feel like it made the story, like, kind of hit a little harder. That's just, you know, a result of just waiting so long to play the game. But yeah, no, I really did enjoy that. I think that the story of the Horizon series is pretty good, and I'm looking forward to what they do next. But as for gameplay, like, I know that they want you to interact with the world, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. So for instance, you start this game with the ability to summon a mount. If it gets destroyed, you have to manually find another mount creature, and the creatures you could use as mounts in this game have been expanded, but you need to find another creature to mount, and as opposed to the first game where you could just resummon it once you were out of range. Like, if it got destroyed, like, it was an ability you can unlock. I don't mind that you have to, like, find a new mount and then you know, retame it, basically using the override. But what I would like is if you could give your mount commands, right? So, like, sometimes maybe you would want your mount to fight side by side with you, right? And then sometimes you want to be able to say to your mount, hey, get out of here, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want you here, it's dangerous. And then the mount could leave, and then you could, you know, then you could fight freely without worrying about your mount trying to run in and get a cheap hit, or just standing there and getting a glancing blow that was supposed to hit you or something. Like, I would much prefer if you could give some kind of control to your mount, whereas every AI teammate that you get in this game does not need to be protected. They all automatically survive pretty much everything that attacks them. For some reason, the mounts just die, and you can hit them and kill them. And to me, that's really weird. And towards the end of the game, I remember I destroyed my mount, but by that point I kind of didn't care anyway, because you didn't really need it. But yeah, I feel like that would be really good, you know, to be able to have an overriding machine that you could, like, because you could kind of give commands to overriding machines. It's an upgrade that you could get in one of the trees, but you can't give commands to your mount, which is weird. There's also a new satchel system in this game, whereas before you had everything equipped, and this one you could choose what you have equipped. Because they changed how the inventory works in this game. In Horizon Zero Dawn, everything that you owned, you carried with you at all times. In this game, they went to a more stash-based system where you can only carry so much with you at any given time. And I don't necessarily mind that. I just feel like there's a lot of stuff to really go off of on this game. The one thing that, like, for instance, right, like, potions. They've completely condensed the amount of potions in this game, and they just made it like one potion that you chug in order to get, like, elemental resistances and stuff, which is fine. But then they stacked a whole bunch of new traps and contraptions onto the D-pad menu. And so this is one of my biggest complaints about the original Horizon game, is that every tool, potion, and ability that you have that's not combat is on your D-pad. So instead of it being like a certain menu for each one, right? Because, you know, like with weapons, if you hold the weapon select button, it brings up the radial wheel like 1,000 other games do. In this game, you have to tab through your satchel one by one by one by one by one by one. And in the heat of combat, you know, on the PS4 controller, if you're moving around, you know, the left thumbstick with your, you know, your left thumb, presumably, you have to either use your pointer finger to, like, go left and right, or you have to, like, take your thumb off and then manually tab through it real fast. It just feels clunky, it feels clumsy, and I wish there was a better way to do that, like maybe, you know, maybe holding the D-pad button brings up a radial wheel, and then you could select that, you know, because it'll slow time and all that, right? Like, that seems like a better system, and that's one complaint I had in the first game that is quite literally not fixed in this game. Nothing changed about that system. Now, there might be less that you need to do on the D-pad, but they didn't fix the system in the first place, so whenever you do, and it's in the heat of combat, I just feel like you're kind of gimping yourself a little bit, because now you have to contend, you know, you have to contest with like bad controls and stuff. And I just wish that that wasn't the case at all. And for such a simple, easy fix, I feel like they could have changed that, especially in the 4 or so many years since the original game. But yeah, I really wish that they had fixed that, because like what they could do, right, is they want to have down be healing, right? Down is healing, or is it up is healing? I can't remember. I think it might be up, actually. Up is always healing. Fine, good. I don't mind that. I actually like that they changed the healing system in this game. But maybe have right be traps, you know, left be potions, and down be tools, like throwing rocks, whistling for your mount, and stuff like that, right? Instead, they just have left and right toggle between and down uses. It's a terrible system. It's something I think that definitely needs to be changed for the next game. And speaking of that, traps on the other hand are pretty much basically also unchanged from the first game. In the first game, one of my biggest complaints was that they give you traps, but in order to use a trap, you have to be on the spot where you need to use the trap, you know, press the trap, you know, button to lay the trap. That takes like a second or two, and then you have to back off. So like if you're stalking an enemy, like if you're stalking, like, say, a monster, and you want it to walk into your trap so you could have an ambush, like, you have to physically walk where it's going to be, put the trap, and then move back to where you want to be, which is totally, you know, super realistic. But in turn, and let's hide, Horizon's not a super realistic franchise. But then you have, you know, then later you have to wait, and then you have to go out and expose yourself and do it. I just wish you could lay traps, and I forgot to close the window. I apologize. I wish you could lay traps. Jesus. I wish you could lay traps just by, like, throwing the trap out. I kind of feel like that would make it just more usable, would be if you could just, like, hold the button to equip the trap and then throw it like you would the rock. I feel like that would be, like, infinitely more helpful for you as a player. You know, it would give you a lot more agency. It would give you a lot more ability for, you know, you to spring an ambush. Because as it stood, I never used traps. I literally played Horizon Zero Dawn, and they had traps. I'm like, oh, this is cool. And then I realized you have to place them. I just never used traps, ever. Quite literally, I never used traps the whole game. And the same thing held true here. What's the point? I have to be exposed to do it. And now that you have so many monsters that fly, and there's underwater swimming, there's not really underwater combat, but, you know, there's so many monsters that fly. They have flying versions of traps. I've never used them. I didn't even think about it. You know, it was no point. So again, like, it feels like some systems in this game they vastly improved, and then others they just didn't touch. They did nothing with. They just said, oh, you know, wipe our hands. Nothing really to say or do about it. So ultimately, I like a lot of the stuff that they did with Horizon Forbidden West. I would say that, like, you know, presentation wise on the PlayStation 5, it looks beautiful. I even had someone come by when I had the game paused and I wasn't recording and say, wow, this looks, you know, they look so realistic on the screen. And I mean, like, you know, to the average person who doesn't really play a ton of games, sure, but for me it was kind of like, oh, you know, that's something interesting, right? You know, we're a far cry from the days of even where the PS4 was like the hyper realistic looking games, you know what I mean? So gameplay wise, Horizon definitely could improve in a lot of ways still. However, I will say that what they have done is very interesting. It's very good. It's very fun. And I actually really enjoy a lot of the gameplay of Horizon. So what would I give Horizon Forbidden West? Well, if I were to give the original game a score, I'd say it's like an 87, right? It's pretty fun. It's got a lot of ups. It's got a couple downs, right? But it's a very, very fun and interesting game. I even played the DLC, which I thought was really fun. But what would I say about Forbidden West? Well, if the original's an 87, I feel like while Forbidden West has really high points and a lot of good points throughout, I feel like there's a lot of average or, like, you know, just sometimes poor points in the game. So I would say like it's an improvement for the most part, but it's definitely not like a super improvement in my opinion. Like it's one of those sequels that definitely tries to expand on the original in every way. So, and for the most part it succeeds. So I would say it's like an 88, right? Like they're very close, I feel. Whereas the original game is very pure of purpose and knows exactly what it wants and needs to do. I feel like Forbidden West instead like tries to it rolls the dice almost on every one of its mechanics, and obviously some rolls are better and things got better, and some rolls are the same and they stayed the same, and some rolls are bad and things got worse. I feel like the crafting system is definitely worse, the upgrade system, sorry. The inventory system is a little bit cumbersome sometimes. The weapon balancing is a little bit worse, in my opinion. I feel like I used more weapons in the original game, right? Because, like, the idea of rebalancing weapons is you want people to use a bigger variety of weapons. Ironically, it kind of had the reverse effect on me. I felt like I used even fewer weapons than I did in the first game because, you know, why am I going to use more weapons, right? Like, what's the point of that? So yeah, I just feel like there's certain things about the game that definitely could have been better, I guess. I mean, I say better, I guess. Yeah, like definitely could have been better. But for the most part, it still is an improvement. They still added a lot. The open world is much bigger. There's a wider variety of things to do, and most of the stuff from the first game does return. So I have to give it the credit. That it is an expansion on the first game. It's just a lot of the underlying systems I feel they messed with that didn't need to be messed with, and I kind of wish that wasn't the case, because they definitely added more human-on-human combat in this game, which I think is pretty good. You're not just fighting big monsters all the time, but I feel like there's a lot of the areas of the map you don't really even need to go to. And there's a lot of other stuff that maybe they could have ironed out. But I would give it an 88 because I thoroughly enjoyed it from start to finish. So with that, I'm SprayingPro1000. Thank you for watching this episode of The Verdict, and I will see you next time.